They said the night had a way of remembering what people wanted to forget. The wind slipped through the trees like it carried secrets too heavy for silence, and even the shadows leaned in as if they were listening. Somewhere in that restless, dark, she heard the words that would change everything. "They call you a savage," she whispered, her voice trembling like it wasn't sure if it wanted to be heard. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. He only turned his head just enough so she could see the outline of his jaw in the moonlight. A slow breath left him, steady, controlled, as though the weight of her words had been expected. His reply came soft, but edged with something that made her pulse quicken. "Then know I could claim you without asking." The air shifted. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Not as a threat, not as a promise, more like an unshakable truth, one that carried the force of something ancient, something untamed. She didn't answer right away. How could she? The distance between them felt alive, filled with an energy that made her chest rise and fall too quickly from... The outside, people always painted him in simple words: wild, untouchable, dangerous. The kind of man you didn't cross unless you were ready to lose something. But standing here, caught in the heat of his presence, she wondered if those same people had ever looked closer. If they had ever seen the quiet storm behind his eyes, the discipline in his stillness, or the strange patience in the way he listened when no one else thought to. Her heart told her he was more than the stories. Her mind reminded her that stories, no matter how twisted, usually carried some truth. The ground beneath them seemed to hum, the forest wrapping around like it wanted to seal the moment inside itself. She realized then that this wasn't about names or reputations. This was about something unspoken, a pull neither of them could deny, a tension that had been building long before the words ever fell from her lips, and yet nothing about it felt safe. She wanted to step back, to shake her head and laugh it off, but her feet stayed rooted as though the earth itself had chosen sides. His gaze held her like it had no intention of letting go, and she felt both trapped and protected in the same heartbeat. Maybe that was the danger of him. The others had warned her. Don't get close. Don't mistake his silence for kindness. Don't confuse his strength for loyalty. But none of them had stood here. None of them had heard the quiet in his voice when he spoke, the way he could lace 4 words together and make them echo louder than a crowd shouting her name. She thought of asking him what he meant. She thought of saying his name just to remind herself that he was human, not the legend that had been whispered through town like a half-told ghost story. But before she could speak, the forest answered first. A sharp crack in the distance. Her head snapped toward the sound, breath catching. His hand moved faster than thought, not touching her, but raised slightly, commanding her to stillness. The authority in that small gesture made her body obey before her mind even registered what was happening. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the night holding its breath. Then another crack, closer this time. She swallowed hard, her voice barely more than air. What was that? He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed locked on the trees ahead, scanning with a calmness that felt impossible. When he finally spoke, it was so quiet she almost wondered if he intended her to hear it at all. They're watching. Her stomach dropped. Every part of her wanted to ask who he meant, but something in his tone warned her against it. He knew. He always knew. The way he carried himself, the way danger seemed to bend around him instead of breaking through, it wasn't by accident. The whisper of movement brushed against the leaves, faint, but undeniable. She leaned closer to him without realizing it, drawn not by choice but by instinct. And still, he didn't move. Still, he stood like the storm she knew was waiting beneath the surface, silent and coiled. "Stay behind me," he murmured. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled into her bones. She wasn't sure if it was safety or warning, but either way, she obeyed. Her hand trembled as she gripped the fabric of her sleeve, trying to steady herself. The woods had always been a place of stories, of hidden paths and forgotten ruins, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt alive with eyes she couldn't see, listening ears she couldn't name. She realized in that moment that stepping into his world meant stepping into shadows that stretched deeper than she had ever imagined. And yet, some reckless part of her didn't want to step back. Her breath caught again as the silence broke, not with another crack, but with laughter. Distant, mocking, carried on the wind like it came from everywhere at once. Her blood ran cold. He finally shifted, shoulders rolling back, chin lifting slightly, not afraid, not surprised. If anything, the sound seemed to sharpen him, like steel meeting a whetstone. "They think I've forgotten," he said under his breath, more to himself than to her. "But I never do." She wanted to ask what he meant, but the laughter rose, again, echoing louder this time, and her words tangled in her throat. The forest no longer felt like a place they could simply walk out of. It felt like a stage, and the curtain had already risen. Her chest tightened as she looked at him, at the calm fire in his eyes, and she realized the truth she had been avoiding since the first time she heard his name whispered in warning. This wasn't just his fight. By stepping close, by speaking the words she had tonight, she had already chosen a side. The laughter cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that was somehow worse. Her ears rang with it, her hands clenched. And then she heard it. A single footstep, heavy and deliberate, breaking the cover of the trees. Her pulse roared in her ears. He finally turned his head toward her, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough to suggest something between defiance and inevitability. His voice was steady when he spoke, but there was something darker laced in the quiet. "Stay close," he said. And just as the first figure emerged from the shadows, the night swallowed everything else. The figure stepped out from the tree line with the kind of confidence that didn't need to be spoken. The torchlight flickered faintly in the distance, but no flame burned in his hand. Instead, the glow seemed to come from the forest itself, shadows bending around him as if the night recognized him and made room. She couldn't make out his face. Not fully, but his outline was sharp enough to know he wasn't alone. More footsteps followed, soft but deliberate, moving in rhythm like a pack. Her breath caught, but before panic could rise, the one standing in front of her shifted just slightly, enough to remind her she wasn't alone either. He hadn't moved. Much, not enough to show weakness, but the slight angle of his body was deliberate, protective, claiming. The forest seemed to lean closer, pulling at the edges of her courage. She wanted to ask who they were, what they wanted, but she held back. Questions could wait. Right now, survival was louder. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until finally the stranger spoke. His voice was low, but it carried in the night. Like it belonged to the trees themselves. "You should have stayed gone." She stiffened, her eyes flicking to the man at her side. His jaw tightened, though his expression didn't change. There was no fear in him, no hesitation, just calm, collected silence that was more unnerving than any anger could have been. He answered with only 2 words, "I never left." The response hung between them, like the spark before lightning strikes. The figures behind the first shifted restlessly, a ripple of unease moving through them. She didn't know what history lived in those words, but she felt the weight of it pressing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The stranger stepped forward, closer now, enough for the moonlight to catch the sharp lines of his face. His eyes were cold, fixed not on her but entirely on the man beside her. "You think standing here makes you strong," the stranger said, "but you've forgotten what strength costs." A faint, almost invisible smile touched his lips. "No," came the calm reply. "I remember too well." Her hands trembled, hidden against her side. Every word they exchanged was a language she didn't understand, but her instincts screamed that it was dangerous. The tension wasn't about tonight alone. It was about something older, something rooted deep enough to split the ground beneath them. The stranger's gaze flicked to her then, sharp and measuring, as though her very presence tilted the balance of the moment. She felt exposed, fragile under his eyes, but before fear could consume her, the man beside her shifted again. His stance didn't change, but the air around him did, firm, unyielding, a wall she hadn't realized she'd already chosen to stand. Behind. "She doesn't belong to you," the stranger said. "And she never will," came the answer, quick and absolute. The words struck her like a wave, though she wasn't sure why. Heat rushed to her cheeks, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't name. Something about the way he spoke them, not as a claim, but as a shield, left her both shaken and strangely steady. The stranger's eyes narrowed. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the restless movement of the others hidden in the dark. Then, without another word, he stepped back, fading into the shadows that had delivered him. One by one, the footsteps followed, vanishing into the forest until only the echo of their presence remained. The night grew still again, but the stillness wasn't peace. It was the sharp quiet after a storm passes, when the air is still charged and waiting. Her voice finally broke through the silence, softer than she meant it to be. Who were they? For the first time, he looked at her directly, the fire in his gaze both grounding and unsettling. He didn't answer right away, like he was weighing the weight of truth against the safety of silence. When he finally spoke, his words were slow, careful. "The past," he said, "and the past never forgets." Her chest tightened, the simplicity of the answer only deepening the questions clawing at her. She wanted to press, to demand clarity, but something in his tone held her back. Instead, she stayed quiet, letting the forest swallow her unspoken words. They walked in silence, the night folding around them. She could feel her heartbeat in every step, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't untangle. The whispers she'd heard about him came flooding back, the warnings, the stories, the way people lowered their voices when his name passed their lips. Savage, untamed, dangerous. And yet none of those words fit the man walking beside her now. His strength was undeniable, yes, but it wasn't reckless. His presence was powerful, but it wasn't careless. Everything about him was deliberate, measured, like a predator who knew his control was more dangerous than his bite. Still, she couldn't deny the truth. The world around him was full of shadows. And now, by stepping too close, she was in them too. As the silence stretched, her thoughts wandered back to the words he'd spoken earlier. "Then know I could claim you without asking." They had settled into her mind like an echo, impossible to shake. She hadn't decided yet if those words were meant as a warning or a promise. Maybe both. She stole a glance at him, his features carved by the faint light, sharp but calm. There was no arrogance in him, no need to boast or prove. His power wasn't in what he said, but in what he left unsaid, and that unsettled her more than anything. The forest grew denser as they walked, the path narrowing until she wasn't sure if they were moving forward at all or being swallowed whole. Every sound seemed louder, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of branches brushing against one another. Her skin prickled with the sense of unseen eyes, the same feeling she'd had when the laughter echoed earlier. Finally, she spoke again, her voice hesitant. "Why? Do they call you that?" He didn't answer at first, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't. Then, without turning his head, he said, "Because people fear what they don't understand." His words lingered in the air, pulling at her thoughts. She wanted to believe him. Part of her already did. But another part knew fear wasn't born without reason. People didn't whisper warnings for nothing. She opened her mouth to ask more, but the ground shifted beneath them, a low rumble, subtle but undeniable, like the earth itself was restless. She froze, her hand reaching out instinctively, brushing against his arm. He didn't move, but she felt the tension coil through him, a silent readiness that spoke louder than words. The rumble faded, leaving only silence. But silence could be louder than noise. His eyes swept the trees, sharp and unblinking. "We shouldn't linger here," he said quietly. She nodded, though her throat was too tight for words. As they moved again, faster this time, her mind spun. With everything she didn't know. Who were those people in the woods? What history bound him to them? What price did strength cost, the way the stranger had said? And most of all, what did it mean for her, now that she was part of it? The night stretched on, endless and heavy, carrying them deeper into shadows that seemed alive with secrets. She didn't know where this path led, only that there was no turning back. Not anymore. And somewhere behind them, hidden in the dark, the laughter returned. The laughter faded, but the echo of it clung to the air like smoke. She couldn't shake, the feeling that the forest was shifting around them, closing in, watching every step. The man beside her walked with the same steady pace as before, but something in the way his shoulders squared told her he'd heard more than she had. His silence was not ignorance, it was calculation. Her thoughts spiraled with questions she dared not voice. If the strangers in the woods were his past, then what did they want now? Why had they singled her out with their gaze? She felt like she'd been pulled into the middle of a story already in motion, and she didn't know the beginning, much less the ending. They reached a clearing where the moonlight poured over the ground, silver and cold. For the first time since the encounter, she saw him step fully into the light. His face, calm yet marked with something unspoken, made her stomach knot. There were scars there, faint but real, each one a story never told. He stood tall, his presence filling the silence, but his eyes seemed distant, as if measuring battles. Only he remembered. She lowered her voice. "What did they mean when they said you should have stayed gone?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might walk away from the question. Instead, he crouched, brushing his fingers against the dirt, tracing something invisible. "Because I left once, and when I returned, I came back different." Her chest tightened at the weight of his tone. Different could mean many things. Broken. Stronger. Wilder. Dangerous. She wanted to press him, but the look in his eyes warned her off. There was history there, jagged and sharp, the kind that could cut if touched carelessly. She stayed quiet, letting the night breathe around them. Yet even in silence, she felt it. The conflict that lived inside him. He carried the weight of something he hadn't shared, something that made the whispers about him only half the truth. He wasn't just dangerous because of what he could do, he was dangerous because of what he refused to say. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint scent of smoke. She frowned, turning toward the tree line. Far off, a faint glow pulsed against the horizon. Her stomach dropped. "Do you see that?" she asked, pointing. His eyes followed, narrowing slightly. "They're sending a message. A fire. A warning." The glow flickered like a heartbeat, steady and intentional. She realized then that whatever game was being played, it wasn't random. This was planned, each move calculated. The people in the woods weren't just wandering shadows. They were organized, watching, waiting. She clenched her fists. Why me? Why are they looking at me like I matter to this? His gaze cut to her, sharp but not cruel. "Because you spoke to me. Because you chose to stand here." Her breath caught. The simplicity of the answer didn't soothe her. It only made the ground feel less steady. She hadn't realized how a single moment, a single whisper, could shift her entire place in the world. They began walking again, but the silence wasn't empty this time. It was filled with the weight of what lingered unsaid. She sensed he was preparing for something, measuring each step like a soldier who knew battle was close. As they moved deeper into the woods, she thought of the warnings she'd heard growing up. Stories about people who lived on the edges of the town, men who carried their rage like a weapon. The whispers said he was the worst of them all, untamable, unbroken, unyielding. But walking beside him now, she couldn't reconcile those stories with the man who had shielded her in silence, whose every word carried not recklessness but restraint. That didn't make him safe. It only made him more complicated. The fire glow faded behind them, but the feeling of being followed never left. She caught glimpses of movement, branches swaying where no wind touched, shadows bending where they shouldn't. He noticed, too. She saw the way his hand twitched near his side, steadying himself as though ready to act if needed. Her thoughts grew heavier with each step. If his past was chasing him, then it was chasing her now, too. She was no longer an observer. She was caught inside the pull of it. Finally, he stopped. The stillness was abrupt, pulling her to a halt beside him. His eyes swept the trees, sharp and focused. Then, without looking at her, he spoke low. "They won't stop." Her throat tightened. "Until what?" "Until I remind them why they called me what they did." The word savage burned in her chest. She had whispered it hours ago, never knowing how far it would carry. Now it felt alive, a title heavy with history she couldn't yet understand. Forest around them creaked, a sound that wasn't quite natural. She glanced around, her pulse pounding, but saw nothing. And yet, she knew. Something was there, watching, listening. She thought of asking him to explain, but she knew the answer wouldn't come in words. It would come in action, in conflict, in whatever storm was brewing at the edges of the night. Silence broke again, but not with laughter this time. It was a whistle, sharp and haunting, weaving through the trees like a signal. Her stomach dropped as more sounds followed, branches cracking, feet moving, shapes shifting in the dark. "They're circling us," she whispered. He nodded once. Calm, cold, ready. Her breath came fast, but she forced herself to steady. She couldn't let fear consume her. Not here. Not now. But deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. The strangers in the woods weren't just threats. They were a reminder that the man beside her didn't just carry conflict. He invited it, whether he wanted to or not. And the moment she stepped too close, she had been marked by it too. The whistle came again, closer this time, and she realized the truth that made her knees weak. They weren't waiting for him. They were waiting for her. The whistle cut the air once more, sharper than before, slicing through the night with an edge that made her chest tighten. Every sound seemed to vanish around it, leaving only the thrum of her pulse in her ears. She glanced toward him, but he didn't move. His body was still, his gaze locked into the darkness like he could see what she could not. Then came the answer. Another whistle, farther away but just as clear, echoing back like a call and response. Her stomach dropped. They weren't random sounds. They were signals. She could feel the forest alive with them now, each one weaving through the trees, mapping a circle around where they stood. Whoever they weren't hiding anymore. They were closing in. She swallowed hard, whispering, "What do they want?" His voice was steady, low, almost calm. Control. The word lingered in the air, heavy as stone. Control of what? Of him? Of her? Of whatever lay in the history that tied him to these shadows. She didn't ask. She wasn't sure she wanted the answer. The leaves shifted, a sound too deliberate to be the wind. She spun, her breath catching as the faint shape of a figure flickered between the trees, then another, then more. Shadows stretched into bodies faceless in the dark, moving with intention. Her chest tightened, panic clawing at the edges of her voice. "We have to go." But he shook his head. his eyes never leaving the tree line. Running would only prove what they want to believe. She didn't understand, not fully, but she trusted the certainty in his tone. It wasn't arrogance. It was experience. He'd been here before, maybe too many times, and yet the danger was different now, because she was here too. The figures grew clearer as they stepped closer, the circle tightening around the clearing. She counted at least 5, but the way they moved suggested more, hidden in the shadows, unseen but waiting. Each one carried silence like a weapon, their steps measured, their faces unreadable. Her breath came fast, and she pressed her hand against her chest, as if she could hold her heart steady. He noticed, and for the first time, he turned his head, slightly, his eyes meeting hers. "Stay behind me." The words were the same as before, but this time they carried a sharper edge, as though even he couldn't predict what was about to come. The first figure stepped into the light, the same man who had spoken earlier. His eyes glinted cold, his mouth curling into something too calm to be a smile. He didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply looked at the man beside her like the clearing belonged to him, and everyone else was trespassing. "You never learn," the stranger said, his voice echoing faintly in the stillness. The man beside her tilted his chin, his voice level. "And you never change." The exchange was sharp, clipped, like two blades colliding before the strike. The stranger's eyes flicked to her then, just for a moment, but it was enough. The air shifted. She wasn't just standing here. She was part of this now. Whether she wanted to be or not, her throat went dry. She wanted to shout that she didn't belong here, that she wasn't part of their fight. But something inside told her it wouldn't matter. She had already been chosen, not by her own will, but by the moment she spoke his name aloud in the quiet of the night. The figures tightened their circle, silent and steady, each one a shadow given weight. The stranger raised his hand, and the movement was enough to make her flinch. But the man beside her didn't. He only shifted his stance, subtle but firm, his body a wall between her and whatever was about to happen. The air was so thick she could feel it pressing against her skin. Every nerve screamed at her to move, to run, but her feet stayed rooted. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was something else, something about the way he stood there, unshaken, ready to face whatever came. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. A stone flew from the shadows, striking the ground inches from her feet. Dirt scattered, the sound cracking through the clearing like a shot. She gasped, stumbling back, but his hand caught her arm, steadying her before she fell. The stranger's voice cut through the night, sharp and final. "You don't belong here." Her chest heaved, her words tumbling out without thought. Then, "Why follow me? Why circle us like hunters?" The stranger's gaze burned into hers, cold and unyielding. "Because he brought you into it." The man beside her spoke before she could, his tone steady but edged with something darker. "She made her own choice." The stranger laughed once, low and hollow. "No, she chose nothing. She was pulled." The words sank into her bones, pulled, as if she was nothing more than a piece in a game too old for her to understand. The figures moved again, the circle closing tighter. Her heartbeat roared in her ears as she clutched the sleeve of his arm, trying to anchor herself. The stranger lowered his hand, and she felt the shift in the air. The first strike was coming. Her eyes darted to him, searching his face for any sign of fear, but there was none. Only a quiet fire, the kind that lived in someone who had stood in the storm before and knew exactly how it would break. She wanted to believe that was enough. She wanted to believe standing beside him meant safety. But as the circle closed in and the forest seemed to hold its breath, she realized the truth. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was theirs. And the first blow hadn't even landed yet. The clearing seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the strike that would split everything apart. The circle of figures pressed tighter, shadows trembling in the torchlight from the distant ridge. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding, uneven and desperate, louder than the forest itself. Her hand stayed wrapped in his sleeve, and though he didn't move, his stance shifted ever so slightly, anchoring her in place. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't hesitant. He was simply waiting for the moment he knew would come. The first figure lunged forward, breaking the silence with the rush of movement. She flinched, instinct forcing her backward, but he was already there. His arm swung in a motion too smooth to be rushed, deflecting the strike and sending the attacker stumbling into the dirt. The others hesitated for a split second, and in that instant she realized what he had said earlier. He remembered too well. This wasn't chaos for him. It was control. The fight broke like a storm. Shadows rushed from every side, but he moved. Like water, flowing, adapting, each strike and block precise. He wasn't wild the way the whispers had painted him. He was disciplined, calculated, each motion sharper than the last. She stayed behind him as he'd told her, but it wasn't enough to shield her from everything. A figure broke through the edge, reaching for her arm. She cried out, stumbling, back. But before fear could consume her, he was there again, grabbing the stranger's wrist and twisting hard enough to send him crashing to the ground. The sound of bone against earth echoed in the clearing. Her breath came fast, her chest heaving, but she forced herself to stay steady. She had been pulled into this, yes, but she wasn't helpless. Her eyes scanned the ground, and her fingers closed around a broken branch. Her hands shook, but she held it tight, ready. The fight surged on, fierce and relentless. The stranger who had spoken earlier stood at the edge, watching, his cold gaze locked on the man who defied him. He didn't strike, not yet. He waited, letting the others move, testing, circling. She realized then that this wasn't about defeating him outright. It was about wearing him down, about proving he wasn't what people said he was anymore. But every time another came forward, he met them with the same steady fire. There was no hesitation in him, no faltering. For every strike aimed at him, he gave back something stronger. And yet, she could see the toll it took. The sweat at his brow, the sharpness in his breathing, the way each movement required more force than the last. The stranger finally stepped forward. The circle widened, the others pulling back to give him space. His presence filled the clearing, his eyes gleaming with something colder than anger. Certainty. He looked at the man beside her and smiled faintly, a gesture too thin to be anything but sharp. "You can't fight forever," he said. The man wiped the sweat from his brow, his voice low but unwavering. "I don't need forever. I just need enough." The words hung between them, heavy and final. Then the stranger rushed forward. Their clash was nothing like the others. It was sharper, heavier, each strike ringing with the weight of history. She couldn't follow every movement, but she could feel the force in each one, the anger in the stranger's blows, the restraint in his responses. It wasn't just strength. It was memory. They moved like two storms colliding, breaking the ground with each impact. And then, for one breathless moment, the stranger stumbled. It was only a flicker, barely visible, but it was enough. The man beside her struck hard, sending him crashing to his knees. The silence that followed was deafening. The others shifted. Uneasily, their unity fractured by what they had just seen. No one moved to help the stranger. No one stepped forward again. The fight was over, though no one had said it. The man stepped back, chest rising and falling with sharp breaths, but his stance remained firm. He didn't gloat. He didn't boast. He simply waited. The stranger rose slowly, his gaze flicking from the man to her. For the first time, his eyes held something other than certainty. They held recognition, perhaps even fear. "This isn't over," he muttered. His voice was low, but it carried through the clearing. Then, with a final glance, he turned and faded into the trees. One by one, the others followed, shadows melting back into the forest until only silence remained. She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her legs shook, the branch still clenched in her hand, though she no longer had the strength to lift it. He finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. His voice was quiet, steady. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though her throat was too tight for words. She wanted to ask what all of this had meant. Why the fire? Why the circle? Why the whispers about him? But in that moment, none of it mattered. He was still standing, and so was she. They walked out of the clearing together, the forest swallowing, the traces of what had happened. The path back felt longer, heavier, but she stayed close, their silence filled with everything they didn't need to say. When they reached the edge of the trees, the horizon was beginning to glow with the faintest light of dawn. She stopped, turning to face him. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly. He met her eyes, his own shadowed with something deep and unspoken. "Because words don't change what people see. They would call me what they wanted to anyway." Her chest tightened. She thought of all the stories, all the warnings, all the whispers of savage and dangerous. And then she thought of the way he had shielded her, the way he had fought not for pride, but for survival. "You're not what they say," she whispered. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, though his eyes stayed sharp. "Maybe, but sometimes letting them believe it keeps them away." The wind shifted, cool against her face. She thought about everything she had seen tonight. The shadows, the fire, the fight. She realized then that she had been wrong from the start. This wasn't just his story. It was hers now, too. As the sun began to break through the treetops, he started walking again, and she followed. The forest behind them held its secrets, but she knew they would return. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but the past never stayed buried for long. Still, as she walked beside him, she felt something new. Not just fear, not just tension, but choice. She wasn't pulled into this anymore. She was standing in it willingly. Her voice was steady when she spoke, though her heart still raced. "Whatever comes next, I won't step back." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but his silence carried more than words could. She understood. The fight wasn't over, but they weren't alone in it anymore. The forest faded behind them as they stepped into the morning light. The night's whispers would linger, the shadows would wait, but for now there was clarity. He had been called savage, untamable, dangerous. But she had seen the truth, and that truth was enough to make her stay.